So, Partners for Climate Action, for those of you who don't know, Partners for Climate Action is a nonprofit based here in the Hudson Valley. And we are really dedicated to addressing the dual challenges of climate change and ecological decline in the bioregion of the Hudson Valley. That's the region that goes from the Berkshires to the Catskills, from Albany down to the tip of Manhattan. So a big area. And we invite you to check out our website if you haven't, climateactionhv.org, to find out more about what we're doing. Now, for this morning's program, after I introduce our featured speaker, Jonathan Bix, he's going to speak for about a half hour, and he has some slides to show us, followed by a period of questions and answers. So for you, if you have questions that you want to ask of Jonathan, please use the Q&A feature down at the bottom of your window. You'll see kind of close to the lower right, there's a tab Q&A with a question mark. Click that, put your questions in there. I'm going to do my best to get as many of your questions answered as possible. Also, if any articles or other supporting materials come up in the conversation, we're going to keep track of those, and we'll send you links to those afterward. And as I said, we are going to post this on our website for future reference. Let me introduce Jonathan. So Jonathan Bix is the executive director and the co-founder of For the Many. After graduating from Vassar in 2014, he became one of the organization's first paid staff members. And he's helped grow the organization into a multi-issue, bilingual organization, and he guides its continued development. He likes to say he loves strategy, project management, coffee, and mornings. So we're happy about all of that, especially the morning part, because we always do these webinars in the morning. And we're also really grateful to be able to count him as a member of Partner for Climate Action's Advisory Council. He's been super helpful to us on a number of fronts. So with that, Jonathan, I'm going to turn it over to you. And again, just welcome you warmly. We're really looking forward to this. And I'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Bob. I got my cold brew here. Hope everybody has their coffee too. And yeah, let's get going. And I'll just share some slides as I'm talking. So yeah, background For the Many. We do multiracial, intergenerational base building for social justice around issue and electoral campaigns in the Hudson Valley. And we organize people across race, across age, from high schools to elders. We organize in both Spanish and English. And we organize people across our differences because we know it will take a majority of us to win. We work to center the needs and leadership of working class people of color in our organizing. So right now, the heart of our work is in Dutchess, Ulster, Orange, and Columbia counties. And we are the main sort of community organizing group that's really rooted entirely in the Hudson Valley. We have 4, soon to be 5 offices, 21 staff in total, and all of our turf is in congressional districts 18 and 19. And we do both partisan and nonpartisan work via several different organizational entities. So the focus of our strategy is based on an analysis that the world is the way it is because of power in politics. So if we want to fundamentally change it at the root, we have to be involved in building our own power for a particular form of politics. So again, sort of our view is the world is as it is mostly organized around short-term private profit is the highest interest. And so if instead we want our world to be more organized around the long-term public good, which is what we want, we have to strengthen sort of our political side, organizing for that long-term aim, and weaken our opponents, namely who we think of as some of the biggest corporations, and billionaires and the political kind of right. So what we do is build power and wield power, and we started first in 2012 as an all-volunteer group. As Bob said, I came on as one of the first 2 staff when I graduated from Vassar in 2014, and we've grown a lot since then. But yeah, so what we do is wield power by trying to deploy it in strategic context. And so for us, that mostly means, organizing money in people related to elections, both in a partisan and nonpartisan way. And yeah, we still think in our nonpartisan work we do, right? We mostly do legislative work is the other big thing we do beside elections. Our decision makers are still elected officials. So electoral power broadly is still going to be the crux of how we have influence for our legislative and issue campaigns as well. We work across issue area because our analysis is that, all issues are kind of connected by power and politics at the root. So it's really, we think, a disadvantage to sort of silo ourselves into one or just a couple issues as opposed to building power across all issues is deeply interconnected. And for us, that's also important because all kinds of, people are motivated by all kinds of different factors, multiple factors. So for example, even if we are primarily motivated by climate as an example, we think it'd be a mistake to just solely focus on organizing money and people around that, because again, it's sort of the same issue of power and politics and how we organize our world is sort of at the root of all of these issues. And building people sort of like together as a group who care about all of these things and want to change the world to be more in sort of the long-term public interest around all these is how we build the most power to change any one and all of these. And all right. So yeah, as I've mentioned before, we try to organize as many people as possible, regardless of what they look like, how much money they have, how old they are, who are excited to take action in favor of this long-term world for the public good that we are trying to build. So this is, some of our folks across some of those differences at a particular action. We organized both based on geographic location. We have Dutchess and Orange and Columbia and Ulster County specific organizing. And we have teams dedicated to that kind of geographic organizing. So for example, this is some of our base in Poughkeepsie. We also organize in Spanish as well as English and organize a lot of Latinx folks. And so this is some of our base in Middletown, New York, which has a lot of Spanish speakers. We also do student organizing on college campuses and high schools. And in many colleges in the area, we have sort of official clubs or chapters, including New Paltz, Bard, Vassar, Marist. So these are some of the students in our New Paltz chapter. We also organize people as workers in partnership with the Teamsters, and especially focus on warehouse workers. And this photo is from one of those actions. So again, just to recap, we organize people based on geography, but also constituency, students, Spanish speakers, workers, tenants as well. And yeah, a big part of what we do is try to organize year round, because we always want to be maintaining momentum and taking action. So the first half of the year, we tend to organize around both state legislative campaigns, because January through June is a state legislative session, and around primary elections, because June is our primary elections. In the second half of the year, we focus more on local laws, because the state legislature is not in session, and on general elections. And a big part of our sort of strategy is our partisan electoral work. Again, I'm not going to go into detail about that because this is not the nature of this call. But just to describe it, our theory is that, the more impactful and powerful our political endorsement is, the more leverage we have over elected officials, whether they're likely to get our endorsement or whether they want to avoid being endorsed against. So we make our endorsement valuable by attaching huge amounts of voter contacts to it in terms of door knocks, phone banks, and we try to limit it to key races where we can make the difference between who wins and who loses. And the idea is that elected officials have to take into consideration, our political work when they're making their decisions, and not just our past or current, future work, but our potential future political work and how that could impact them. So yeah, as I already said, the goal of it is both to just directly elect folks that are more in line with our long-term vision, to apply some pressure to folks that are maybe more oriented on their own careers, to sort of like get more in line with our vision if they want our support, or at least don't want to be against us. And we just try to shift what is possible in a more progressive direction. And so a big part of our strategy is obviously, reaching tens and hundreds of thousands of people with a message. And so for us, what's really important when thinking about our messaging is the nature of polarization and strategy. And for us, polarization is something that is just sort of natural and always happens, right? For very deep at their roots evolutionary reasons, we tend to think of the world as in different groups, and sort of like us as part of some groups and not others, and often in terms of an us and a them. And so the question is, how do we organize these groups? And that's a big part of what drives our messaging. So for us, again, a lot of people treat politics as if it's sort of like a neutral, just kind of deeply logical conversation. And it is elements of that, but it's also really about telling a story about these groups and which kind of groups and belief different people should subscribe to and why. So what we want to do is create sort of our argument about the way this polarization exists in a way that's favorable for us to get sort of like the most people as possible aligned with our side of these debates. And yeah, the sort of way we move people across the sort of spectrum from opposition to neutral to active support is this polarization in a way, that speaks to people's needs and speaks to their real feelings and the things they experience every day, but also sort of points them in an ultimate direction that's about, seeing their self-interest in the long-term public good that we are, and rejecting sort of attempts to frame their in-group as something that's based on, racial division or inequality, but saying that, working people across race, across language, across background have this shared self-interest in the long-term public good, and that there are actions we can take to make the world more like that world that we want, and less as it currently is, organized around short-term, sort of private profit is the highest incentive. So we're trying to create this progressive sort of populist identity that unites people, like I said, across race, across class, across age, into this sort of shared vision of a world that works for all of us when we think across race, class, gender, and the environment, as opposed to just being set up for the short-term private profit of a wealthy few. And a lot of folks have had success creating this broad multiracial progressive populist coalition, such as Obama, regardless of what we think or not think about what the administration did or didn't do. Obama did a really great job of creating this sort of multiracial, multi-class coalition. And Bernie Sanders has done quite a good job of also articulating sort of the them or the small group that coalition is in sort of opposed to. So we're trying to build on this by sort of creating a progressive multiracial populism with sort of Obama's broad multiracial, multi-class us, and Bernie's very small sort of them or opposition, or basically just billionaires and politicians that do their bidding, that are more interested in short-term private profit than the well-being of all of us. So again, sort of like the story we're telling is this multiracial working class us that includes, basically everybody we talk to, and a small them that is powerful and exclusive. And yeah, our sort of messaging is about creating cross-racial solidarity for shared prosperity through this sort of like government working for all of us. And yeah, we know that sort of the narrative that we're hearing from our political opponents is often about dividing people up based on racial animosity, based on citizenship status or documentation or language or culture. So a big part of our narrative is saying that, while we have differences, while we don't all have the same experiences, we have this broad shared self-interest, and uniting across these differences is how we get closer to that world that is in all of our self-interest as a multiracial working class. And so the way that this plays out in a more specific level, because that's pretty theoretical, is our context is New York State, ultimately. And we do a lot of very local work on policy and elections in the Hudson Valley, but also ultimately there are many, many things locally that are actually decided at the state level. New York State has vast control of, the economy. Yeah, and just like ultimately really deeply shapes the Hudson Valley. And it's also one of the few state legislatures where there's Democratic trifectas and Democratic supermajorities. And so it's really in the hands of the Democrats, what happens or not at the state level. And that's really huge, considering I think New York, if its own country, would have like the 10th largest economy in the world. So it's not just about the Hudson Valley, but what happens at the New York State level has really huge impacts on the world. And yeah, in 2020, we and other folks in the Working Families Party played a big role in making this the sort of state Senate controlled by Democrats as opposed to Republicans in the Independent Democratic Caucus, and sort of set it up for what it is now, which is that Democratic trifecta and supermajority. So yeah, an example of how we sort of are trying to continue to shift the state legislature to be more favorable for climate and progressive issues in general. I'm going to go through climate as a case study of sort of all this stuff that I'm talking about. So I think because we're all in this call, we probably all agree that our current energy system is driving climate change and quite life-threatening and unaffordable for the vast majority of people. And we want to change that. So our biggest contribution to that the last couple of years, I would say, is work that we did a couple of years ago to help elect Sarah Hannah Shrestha, who's now an assembly member for the Hudson Valley. We made a whole lot of voter contacts by knocking doors, by making calls, by sending mail. And a whole sort of basis for the election was that we aren't seeing enough from our current elected officials on taking strong support for climate measures. And she ran a campaign that was really rooted in climate justice and specifically energy around passing the Build Public Renewables Act, which a number of different folks had been fighting for a long time, but had not been moving in the state legislature. And then the year after she won, not coincidentally, we did actually win the Build Public Renewables Act at the state level, because what her election kind of showed was, again, sort of, Democrats have supermajorities in the state, and what progress we're not making in the state that we want to is really being stopped by more conservative Democrats at the state level. We don't really have Republicans to blame at the state level. So our message is kind of, if Democrats in the state legislature are not doing enough to move the ball forward, that change can happen that will be better suited to make that move. And that's sort of what Sarah Hannah's victory represented, and I think people saw that, and therefore the Build Public Renewables Act was passed the next year. And folks might already be familiar with it, but if you're not, this is one of, I think, the most exciting pieces of climate legislation that's passed in the country and the state level. It creates a mandate for the state to build and own renewable energy. And yeah, part of the law is that the state and municipally owned properties have to use 100% renewable energy by 2030. And it also cuts rising energy costs for low-income households and creates just transition and job training and investment in frontline communities. So this was kind of a case study of some of the work we do. So what's on our plate next in terms of legislative campaigns and elections? I'll start with legislation first. One of our priorities is the New York Heat Act. And yeah, in particular, just trying to decrease the state's investment in fossil fuels and increase investment in renewable energy and affordability. So that did not get through during this most past legislative session, but it's something that we and others are still educating the public and elected officials on. We're also sort of educating people about the rest of what's called the Climate Jobs and Justice package, which was created by New York Renews, which some of you all may be familiar with, which is a state climate coalition that we're on the steering committee of. The Climate Change Superfund Act did make it through the state legislature on the last day of the session. So it's something the governor may sign into law. We shall see. And another big focus of ours coming up is going to be educating people on the Hudson Valley Power Authority Act, which was introduced recently and is co-sponsored by Hudson Valley State Legislative elected Sarah Hannah Shrestha, who I mentioned earlier, and State Senator Michelle Hinchy, which would create a new state power authority, the Hudson Valley Power Authority, that would be authorized to take over Central Hudson and run it as a publicly owned and democratic energy utility, whose goals would be better service and low rates and environmental justice. And at the same time as we're fighting proactively for these climate gains at the state level, we are also trying to make sure to defeat attempts to sort of roll back the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which is something that fossil fuel companies and politicians that they've kind of bought off are still working on, even at the same time as they're trying to move the ball forward on climate. So for example, last year, some legislators put forward this bill that would have really undermined CLCPA by changing the way that methane emissions were counted, which would have allowed for many, much greater methane emissions. And so thankfully, because there was a huge outcry about this bill from tons of community groups, from the biggest greens to the smallest greens, some of whom you can see listed here, that bill was beaten back for now. And in terms of what's coming up for us in elections, we are working on a primary and assembly district 106. Primary day is June 25th. Some of you may be in this district, which you can see represented here. I'm not going to get super deep into it on this call, but feel free to reach out to me if you're interested in talking more about this race or the dynamics around this election. We're also going to be involved, regardless of how that primary goes, in the general election in congressional districts 18 and 19, which were two of the closest congressional races in 2022 and may determine who is control of the House of Representatives after this cycle. As you can see, they were each decided by just a few thousand votes. They're expected to be similarly close this time around. So this is Congressional District 18. It includes pieces of Dutchess, Orange, and Ulster counties. And this is the very large Congressional District 19, which some of you may be in as well, which goes from the easternmost edge of Columbia all the way to Ithaca. So it's quite large. In addition to sort of partisan work we'll be doing for the general election, we'll also be doing a lot of nonpartisan work around identifying non-voting sort of folks or low propensity voters that care about the environment and helping to push them to vote. And we'll be doing that through a combination of public and private data that we can find on people. And yeah, we'll be just urging them to vote and educating them about what's at stake via door knocking, phone banking, mail, and digital ads. And that is my presentation on who we are and what we do. And I will pass it back over to Bob. You're still on mute, Bob.
Sorry. Now hopefully you can hear me now, right? Had it on mute. Okay. So thank you so much, Jonathan. That was great. And I want to encourage everybody, if you have questions, use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And I'll be taking a look at those and do my best to get those answered. And I have a couple of questions I want to start out with, Jonathan. First of all, I was thinking as you were giving your presentation, I was wondering how you define climate justice and environmental justice. What do you say when people ask you what it is?
Sure. And I'll also mention quickly that I forgot to do my pitch for people joining us to take action. So I just dropped the links to volunteer and donate in the chat. I encourage everybody to click on one or both of those, which I'll also follow up about by email after this. But yeah, I think very simply speaking, we think about climate justice as doing what is good for the planet and people. And we view those things as deeply intertwined. So again, we kind of reject this very strong separation between sort of climate and economics and racial justice or labor, and think that all things are very deeply intertwined. So for us, addressing sort of like climate and pushing forward climate justice is thinking not just about the type of energy we produce, but who produces it, how, and yeah, advocating for good jobs, union jobs, and also affordability of energy, and also not having people's power shut off if they fall behind on their energy bills.
Great, thank you. I think folks would also be curious because you work in so many communities that are designated as New York State disadvantaged communities. Be interesting to hear some examples of how you find these communities are particularly disadvantaged from a climate justice perspective. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So as most people know, sort of the negative impacts of pollution and climate change and environmental degradation are, yeah, sort of differentiated for people, usually based on a combination of class and race. So for example, one of the things we've done in the past is sort of organize people around Central Hudson's policy around high bills and shutoffs, as well as use of fossil fuels. And we got the Public Service Commission to sort of open a case around examining Central Hudson shutoff practices several years ago. And what that case ultimately found was Central Hudson was using sort of a formula of efficiency to help determine whose power they would shut off. Like when people fell behind on their bills, they would say, okay, we're going to help figure out whose power we turn off and who we don't based on the most efficient route our trucks sort of take for shutting off the most people in the shortest amount of time. And so because of like class and racial patterns and housing segregation, poor people of color end up having their power shut off the most by Central Hudson in that instance. So the Public Service Commission instructed them that they couldn't use that sort of formula of efficiency for determining shutoffs. Yeah, it's not just sort of the consumer side in terms of climate impacts. Working class people of color are most impacted by pollution and degradation. And so, for example, a lot of the folks we organize in Newburgh and Poughkeepsie have been dealing with completely polluted water for a very long time, both with lead pipes and in Newburgh, sort of PFOS spillover. So yeah, for a long time, we've been organizing people to push electeds to replace sort of lead pipes and otherwise intervene in sort of fixing up the water systems in Poughkeepsie and Newburgh as another example.
Great, thank you. Now, here's a good question from Margaret. What do you find to be the most effective in sustaining community engagement over time? In other words, keeping people engaged.
Yeah, I think something that I think something that's important to think about is a lot of people, don't have much time, and most people have a lot of other interests. I mean, we're kind of the weird ones, right? Most people wouldn't get up at 8:30 a.m. to be on a webinar about climate issues. And most people are not sort of motivated by abstract interests, but they're really motivated, by making their lives better. And also, like, if they're taking time to do sort of these actions, they want it to be meaningful. So we try to make very effective use of people's time and show that their time is very meaningful and very effective, as opposed to having sort of, endless meetings that don't have a purpose or not sort of having a clear strategy. We try to provide a very clear strategy, and we're saying, hey, this is the opportunity you have with a little bit of time to make a difference in your life and your neighbors' lives. Do you want to do it or not? So yeah, I think just showing people that they can be very effective with what impact they make in a limited amount of time. And also, of course, building a sense of community and making things fun and exciting. Yeah, but not forgetting that sort of the ultimate aim is to really make a difference. Yeah, it's something that we really try to emphasize, and that has been helpful, I think, for sustaining engagement, because people see that what we've done and what they can plug into is in fact effective for creating change and improving their lives and their neighbors' lives.
Great. Here's another question about you do a lot of Spanish language translation. In fact, I think almost everything you guys produce is in 2 languages. I'm curious, how many people, like what's the either the percentage of Hudson Valley population or kind of approximate numbers of folks who you feel are really making use of that? The work wouldn't happen without it.
Yeah, so we try to reach tens to hundreds of thousands of people with some kind of Spanish language message each year. But we probably have about 1,000 or so more active volunteers that are primarily Spanish speaking. And yeah, we organize, like I sort of said, across race, age, and language. But yeah, sort of very substantial portions of our bases are either young people in high school and college, or sort of Spanish speakers, either first or second or third generation Latinx immigrants.
Mhm. Great, thank you. Yeah, and also I know because we have graduate interns from Bard, including Kate, who's helping organize this call with us. Um, and we work with a lot of young people as well, and do a number of things on college campuses. And I know your internships, the For the Many internships, are like the cool internships that that everybody wants. Um, so kudos to you for that. Um, yeah, the numbers of young people that you're working with, I'm curious about as well. And do you see that growing in terms of engagement of young folks? And also, I guess, age range. What is the age range of young folks you're working with?
Yeah. So the age range varies quite a lot. We again have very frequent high school sort of volunteers and interns as well. But yeah, in particular, also have college sort of clubs and students and interns. But then yeah, also work with everybody from middle age to elderly. Yeah, it really spans generations, which is I think part of what makes it fun and meaningful. I feel like I forgot the first part of the question, but I feel like there was a first part before the age.
Yeah, well, no, I just wanted to get a sense for numbers of folks, really. That's what it
Gosh,
was.
right. So yeah, I would say, yeah, I mean, several hundred sort of like high school and college students take some kind of action with us every year, whether that's coming to a meeting, coming to an event, donating, fundraising, being involved in our voter mobilization. And yeah, so we end up sort of like touching in various ways, tens of thousands of young people every year, but it's based on a more active core of a few hundred, and even more narrowly, a smaller core of 100 or so that, give several hours a week every week for most of the year to it.
Great, great. Here's a question from Dan. In your work on issues related to New York Power Authority, have you looked at the role of New York State canals? New York State Canals is under the Power Authority and runs a huge deficit, so could potentially be a significant drain on meeting public renewable goals associated with the Power Authority's current and future work. So have you looked into the role of the New York State canals?
Not at all, actually. So if whoever wrote that is interested in following up with me or anybody else is interested in following up about anything, I also just dropped my email in the chat. So yeah, I would love to learn more because I don't know anything about that.
Great, great. And here's another question from Keisha. I'm relatively new to the Hudson Valley region and am intrigued by the intersection of home rule and large issues like climate justice. What do you see as the benefits and challenges of making gains in climate concerns within small jurisdictions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, I mean, the sort of constraints or that there are many fundamental impactors of the climate that simply are driven by state policy at the state level, and we can't change at the very local level, which is why we do state level work. But also, state level work is very hard and long term and not immediate. So we do more immediate local work, both so people can see some immediate results. So that we can make a difference and that people have some kind of benchmarks, yeah, as part of their sort of like work towards long-term statewide change. But yeah, there are many things that just simply have to change at the state level. So yeah, that is kind of the North Star for the work that we do at the local level, is trying to build towards that broader, more fundamental change.
Mhm. Great, thank you. Yeah, I want to encourage people, if you have questions, remember to use the Q&A function to get them in there. Couple more questions. What's the size of your operating budget at For the Many?
Yeah, so it's basically just over a couple $1 million. We have several different entities that are separate and have separate budgets, but roughly that's where we're at now, which has been quite significant growth since we first started in 2012. We were just a bunch of volunteers in a church basement. Our first office was about 200 square feet and had no windows. So my coworker got like a vitamin deficiency. So as you can see, we now have windows in our much larger Poughkeepsie office, and have several offices across the Hudson Valley, which I'm pleased to report are all much bigger than 200 square feet and all now have windows. Yeah, so it's improved a lot.
All right, that's great. And where are your offices? What towns are they in?
Yeah, so Poughkeepsie, Newburgh, Kingston, Middletown, and Hudson are sort of the core cities in which we operate and have offices in.
Mm-hmm. And can you explain for folks the different entities that are under your umbrella or that are within the orbit of For the Many?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a C3, which is called For the Many Education Fund, which is fiscally sponsored by the Tide Center. We have For the Many, which is C4, fiscally sponsored by Tides Advocacy. And we also have two different political action committees, which are our own entities. So this, I could talk about this for hours as its own topic. But yeah, just for the sake of a short answer, we have several different entities which sort of do this combination of partisan and nonpartisan work. Yeah, and a couple of them fiscally sponsored by Tides, and a couple of them are independent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. Here's a question from Vanessa. In emissions reduction work, so much of the emphasis has been on switching to heat pumps and EVs. But is that emphasis missing the mark with lower income folks? What are the ways to address emissions that are most meaningful to lower income folks?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think a lot of climate interventions that we're able to make at the moment are things that don't as deeply get to the root of the problem as they could, right? Because, sort of our main opponents, the huge sort of like fossil fuel companies, are okay with like small level changes or like tinkering in the consumer market, as opposed to things that like really fundamentally shift the rules of our like society and economy away from fossil fuels and towards renewable and public energy. So I think not just for working class people, but all people, if we seriously want to avoid disastrous climate change, really is about making society-wide shifts towards investing in publicly owned, renewable, affordable energy on the scale of, industries in our economy, as opposed to just sort of like individual, sort of like consumer choices in the market. So I don't know if that precisely answers the question, but yeah, I do think that sort of like ultimate industrial focus is what we all need to really seriously move towards a transition.
Great, thank you. Here's a question from Joseph. Would you further discuss the strategic considerations in selecting the territory in which For the Many works? How has that changed since your founding? Where else, if anywhere, do you see it growing?
Sure, it's a great question. So, it was somewhat arbitrary in the sense that we founded it where we were, which was Poughkeepsie, a bunch of us who got involved in sort of organizing. But yeah, it's sort of like its growth is based on a number of things, both sort of like populations and demographics. But also, as I said, a lot of our analysis was about how can we move things in a more progressive direction at the state level. And so we do try to work within both sort of like areas that are deeper blue, where we can sort of like push the envelope in terms of like making sure that we're represented by people that are not just Democrats, but progressive. But we also very intentionally do work in purple areas where we're kind of trying to, shift the balance of power from a more conservative to a more progressive direction, even if it's not sort of like ultimately our end goal. So yeah, and we're trying to grow in a way that is strategic. We're really focused on building real concentrated power where we are. So we haven't super quickly expanded to a huge geography. But yeah, we are deliberately interested in expanding into areas where we can make a difference. So yeah, that's how we sort of have expanded from just the city of Poughkeepsie, where we first started, to now Dutchess, Orange, Ulster, and Columbia. And yeah, I think we're very much open to more growth when and if we get the resources to do so. But yeah, aren't interested in kind of like superficial paper expansion. That isn't a very serious expansion of our organizing and impact.
Mhm. I remember when you first started, you had a different name for your organization. It was Nobody Leaves Mid-Hudson.
That's true.
Can you, and you, that was inspired, and I imagine, I don't know if this is true. I mean, I know you were a student at Vassar. Were the other founders all students at Vassar? Did you find each other through Vassar and realize this was something you want to dedicate yourselves to? And how did you land on Nobody Leaves Mid-Hudson?
Yeah, so the founding group was a combination of long-time City of Poughkeepsie residents who are not students, with several of us who were Vassar students. And we mostly came together because of all of our sort of involvement in Occupy and interest in community organizing for social change. And when we first started, we actually more narrowly focused on housing and particularly foreclosure and eviction as an issue that we were organizing around. So yeah, one of the groups that helped train us and help us get started was called Springfield No One Leaves, kind of like the idea nobody should be forced to leave their home. So yeah, I don't take responsibility for our first name. I don't remember exactly how we came up with it, but yeah, our first name was sort of like a play on Springfield. No one leaves his name. It's sort of the anti-displacement angle. But as we grew and sort of expanded and professionalized, it became clear that our name was very confusing and long and hard to spell and maybe slightly threatening, and just didn't fit with what we were doing any longer. So yeah, we went through a big rebranding process that rolled out in 2021 that included the name change.
Mhm. Great, great. Yeah, we our own organization, for those of you who've been following us, we've gone through a couple of different names before we landed on Partners for Climate Action. And I mean, I think it fits who we are, but probably if we're all honest with our organizations, we can all think of probably different names, other names, but I think you landed on a good one for the many. It really says it. And one more question on my end, and again, if others have questions, put them in the Q&A box. I'm curious if there are organizations, other organizations who you all work with, who you feel are strong, natural collaborators, any potential, any collaborations, just to give us a picture of that.
Yeah, quite a few. So one of our main political homes is the Working Families Party, which we're an affiliate of, and we're quite close to the other community and labor organizations that are affiliates of theirs. So yeah, community groups like Citizen Action and Make the Road in your communities for change. And yeah, sort of unions like the Teamsters, and CWA and UAW and many other folks, yeah, are some of our closest allies. And we also are on sort of steering committees, or otherwise active in a number of statewide coalitions, including New York Renews, including the Public Power Coalition, Energy Democracy Alliance, Housing Justice for All, Excluded Workers Funds Coalition, and many others. I won't go through all the names, but yeah, there is quite an ecosystem. in New York State and beyond of power-focused organizations like ours, who we work very closely with.
Great, great. Okay, thank you. I think we're at the end of our time. This has been super informative for us. We're really grateful to you, Jonathan, grateful to For the Many that you're there. And I'll just remind folks, you can look in the chat. Jonathan's dropped in his email address and also a couple of links if you want to volunteer or donate. We are going to send a copy of this recording to each of you so you can watch it again and share it with friends. We're also going to put it up on our website. Let me also say, just in terms of other dates that we at Partners for Climate Action want you to know about, we have a whole learning journey we're starting around healthy forests, understanding that our forests are really at risk right now due to a number of factors. So we have on June 20th a lecture that's going to take place the community college outside of Hudson, the Columbia Green Community College, on the 20th. But it's also available through Zoom for those who are interested. This is with Brendan Quirion, who's the senior person at DEC, just to kind of kick us off and help us at Partners, but also help anybody else who's interested to begin to wrap their brain around the multiple issues. And then on June 25th, we're also sponsoring a healthy forest walk. Our forests are so degraded, which most people don't know, largely through the, number of factors: climate change, invasive species, overbrowsing of deer. We're going to go into what's called a deer exclosure over several acres and see what a forest is supposed to look like, and juxtapose that with the rest, and again, continue our learning around this. So we encourage you to come along with us. And also look forward to September 19th. Put that on your calendars. That's going to be our next climate mixer. We're always happy we can pull together 200, 300, 400 people, all climate activists like us, to meet each other and learn from each other. So look for that. And yes, thank you again to everyone for coming. Thank you especially to Jonathan. It's great hearing about your work For the Many. So we'll say goodbye for now, and we'll see you next time.